You can get started.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our TLC event for today. My name is Don Saucy. I'm the Faculty Associate Director for the Teaching and Learning Center. I'll remind you that if you aren't ready toward a teaching and learning certificate, either as a faculty member or as a graduate student, please do your post-event survey that you'll get after this. But today we are thoroughly excited that you took time out of October, which is amazing because it's October and we're all super busy. And that's why this is even more important, because McCrea is going to talk to us about how we can make our classes better and more fulfilling in terms of experiential teaching, particularly for the humanities that need to apply beyond that. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Heather.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for coming during your lunch hour in the middle of the busiest month in the fall academic year. I'm Dr. Heather Mcrae. I teach in the Department of History. I've been here 13 years now, I think. I was trained as a Latin Americanist at Stony Brook University, where I received my PhD, but also in history of medicine. So I teach pretty regularly on our campus social history of medicine, and then, well, depending on necessity, modern Mexico, nation building in Latin America, Aztecs, Inca, Maya, that kind of stuff on the undergraduate level. And one of the things that I've experienced in the classroom, especially when we have these long 3-hour block classes or even the 90-minute block classes, is that I like those, but I also hate them. So I like them because I can get a lot done. I can give the students breaks. We can have conversations out in the hall. I don't like them because particularly the 3-hour ones are really hard to get through. So I invented, by pulling shamelessly from some of my friends and other sources, a way to keep them engaged in the classroom and teach them some of the basic skills a historian would have. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to treat you like my students, and I'm going to hand out readings for you. These are primary source documents. So if you've been here before, just play like it's all new. And this is what I call a cold read. I give them zero information, and then I hand them the document. And I plunk some of the groups in the middle of the document, just to make it all the more weird. Okay, so I designed this so that we'd be in groups of like 3, and you all will have your own stuff to read. But the point of the matter is that you can read by yourself, but I want you to chat in your group. So I was one of those students in college that was like, ew, group work bad. But I think I've made it tolerable now for some of my students. We'll see. So I'm going to hand out to the first 3 over here the documents that you are to read. And you all are reading different documents. They're from the same collection, but they're all different. And so you will then talk to each other about what you read. And then if you time it correctly, you can do it in a way so that they read it and then they have a break and they can chat in the bathroom and stuff about it. What did you wear? Thank you. There we go. And then this is the same one these 2 ladies have. We have 1, 2, and we'll do 2 here. And then let's see who still doesn't. We'll start over 101. How many by what? 4 people? Okay. So you get to be group of 4 and you guys get to be group of 2. Okay, so there you go. 4. Oh, printed on both sides. So while you're reading these, I would like you to get out some paper and jot down what you think the following 3 things are that you note in these documents. The first one, I call them the 3 C's. Content. What on earth is happening? What's going on in your document? Just write that down. Context. Can you figure out where in space and time and place this is happening? Take a good educated guess. And consequences, which I also refer to as stakeholders. Like, what are the probable outcomes based on just what you read? Who has the most to lose? Who has the most to win? Or can you not even tell? Because historians also look at the spaces where there's no information, where we can't find anything, and ask ourselves why. So if you can't tell, if you can't answer these, that's also important. Write that down. Can't tell. Too weird, too out of place, don't understand. So content, context, and consequences. Now I'll leave you alone. It'll take about 10 to 12. This is a good one. Let me see what page you're done. If you could sit here and you could join. Oh, you're sitting over there. Oh, okay, that's fine. So, let's see. So,
in the computer science department by the expert ministries, here in my wife that teach Italian, Latin, and Greek in Italy, and here as an example, just and she is looking around. So an expert is there.
nobody here is an expert in history. So, all I did was hand these out. Everybody's reading. And it's a cold reading. I don't give you any information. You just have to read this and try and figure things out. And then we'll all talk. So you want to look for content, context, and consequences. Over there as well. So from this, who's talking? Can you figure out what's going on? Environment and consequences. What's the outcome? Who stands to lose the most, gain the most? Or can you not tell? And it's printed on both sides. And so you'll talk to each other and then we'll all talk to each other because everybody's reading different stuff. So I can kind of keep people who are reading the same things in the same place. So. you hear what I told the other
No,
couple?
I just.
Consensus, maybe. And just so you know, if you're doing this in your classroom, it's perfectly fine to go around and go, hey, what's going on? What y'all think?
So is that a real question or you just?
No, hey, what's going on? What do y'all think?
So I think it is one of those things where in human subject research training, they tell us about the study where this happened. So I think without that context coming into this, I'd have been thoroughly confused. But once I put enough of the puzzle pieces together and said, oh, this is what they're talking about, like she put it together much quicker than I did, that this is like minutes of a meeting or something like that. And I didn't, but.
And a big clue, starting on page 9.
Right.
Yeah. You know, I mean, but yeah, you know, some of the things that we have to read as historians are just boring, you know, but once in a while you get a gem. Okay, move on, we'll come back in a minute. Okay, historians, I'm skipping you. Because, well, actually, technically, she's not a historian,
Not a historian,
but,
just got stuck with the history.
but she's teaching history of fashion. How cool is that?
Good to see
Okay,
you.
still gonna skip her. All right, let's see, did you all have the first part? Yes, the autopsy, you guys got the main one. Well, how are you? What do you think? Can you figure, I mean, you guys got the most content.
Yeah.
You able to figure anything out, like who, like for instance, stakeholders, who stands to lose the most?
Definitely the best.
Yes. And sometimes what seems the most obvious answer, and we put it away because our analytical brain, oh, that's too simple, is actually the correct answer. Yeah, okay. And I'm going to give you some time to finish up. What are we doing over here? Stuck in the middle of a document.
Good. I feel like we're at the end because we've got,
Yep,
like,
you've got it.
the quote answers. I
Yeah, well, and then
guess.
you don't forget back here.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know that's how it happens sometimes. is
Yeah.
You get the meaty part or so your consequences stuff is going to be pretty good.
Yeah. Mm.
All right. How are we doing over here? Have we got time to read or we need a little bit more time? It is a very cold read. I've given you zero preparation for this. So you have to guess and glean, you know, kind of divine, figure out, do detective work, content, context, consequences. Okay? Do you have any idea? I mean, you know where this is happening, right? Okay. So think about who stands to lose the most, who stands to gain. Okay. Okay, so still reading. All right. If you haven't started chatting in your groups, please try to do that within the next 2 to 3 minutes. Finish up your reading, even if you have to speed read. Okay, I'll just insert a little bit of information for those of you who will be maybe trying to teach something like this. And, you know, you always give them a sort of heads up, let's wrap it up, speed read, get through it. And then what I usually do, but we're not going to do it because of time, is I have one student, and usually in a female-dominated class, I make it be a male student because of the whole correlation between the females being the ones that write everything down and the men just not. So I try to break that up a little bit because I've seen that repeated over and over and over again in my classes. It's always the female that is doing the recording. But that's just my thing after I saw that happen. I have one person be the recorder, usually with less than serial killer like handwriting. So good handwriting, good penmanship, kind of hard to find. And I have all the students put their name at the top of the piece of paper, and then they write down their answers to content, context, and consequences, and then they pass it around, photograph it, send it to me, and then I post it so that all the rest of the classmates can see their other classmates' answers to context, content, and consequences. They then have to write a primary source analysis paper for me that answers, what do you think? Content, context, and consequences, about 2 pages, single space. And they do this at about 5 junctures in my class with different sets of documents. So just so you know how that is integrated in. Usually I end up dropping the lowest one because the first one's usually like, and so now what I'm gonna do is, after they would have written all this down, is I'm gonna come around and I'm gonna ask each group individually what you noticed, what you read, and then we're gonna pull it all together like pieces of a puzzle or detective work, okay? So by the way, these are declassified documents from the US National Archives, which if you go to archives.gov and type in some of these keywords, you should have no trouble finding and downloading these exact same documents. I shouldn't say you should have no trouble. A few clicks here and there and rabbit holes and drop down menus and you'll get there. We do have a resource librarian here with us. Oh, sorry, I might be able to give you more specific instructions. But anyway, these are available. They're in the public domain. So, okay, I'm gonna start with the group that started reading first. I think it's over here. So, actually, I'm not gonna start with you guys because you guys had the first part. I'm gonna start with right in the middle here with my historians. So,
No pressure now. No pressure.
okay, so what did you glean from this?
Say for what we have, it's essentially like a very shorthand meeting minutes between doctors discussing a study in 30 years after it started, and they're trying to debate about what to do with the results of the study. They acknowledge that the methods used in the study they're not ethical. It's not going to go over well in the public, but they're struggling over the decision to, well, if we don't use the data, then the study was for absolutely nothing. And we can transition it into a study of pathology, and then questions come up, well, do you or don't you maybe better compensate the participants of the study who are still alive? And it has the ramifications potentially of affecting the US military, the Air Force Academy, the doctors, or the politicians who funded the study. So at the end of it, it's pretty clear that they intend to use the data of the syphilis case. They're going to use it. It's just they're deciding how they're going to package it to make it more digestible to people.
Very well said. So yes, so the word I'm going to glob on from what Melanie just said is ethics. And then usually I would go and I'd stick it on the whiteboard, ethics. And then we would come back to it because I want them to get some big ideas and then we narrow it down. I'm going to go over here because I believe they also have meeting minutes. So tell us what you gleaned from your section.
It was hard because right away I was familiar with this case. So we kind of put it into that context, and I wasn't as sure it would have made much sense without that kind of context. Sure. But we saw people kind of, in a fairly uncaring way, thinking about doing the damage control on the study. So is $50 enough to give to the people who had done this? They might appreciate if we gave them care. So it wasn't a moral imperative that they were kind of doing. They were kind of figuring out how is it that they could make this as soft as possible.
Yeah.
Because they were worried about covering their butts, not because they saw that as a humanitarian.
Right.
How can we establish rapport with this community?
And I forget if in your section of minutes they mentioned the rapport with the community, mentioned Nurse Rivers. Yeah. So Nurse Rivers wrote her own book, and there's a movie, Miss Edgar's Boy, that is based on Nurse Rivers' testimony. I'm gonna pull it all together here in a minute. Can you divine from this where in time and place we are? Just to state what might seem obvious.
This meeting must be in the 60s.
So 30 years after, like Melanie said.
Georgia?
Yep. Yep, there we go. Yeah, so see, these people think, oh, history is so hard. I'm like, no, we guess a lot and then we put it together. It's just about who's doing what, when, and why. You know? And so that's perfect, yes. And so that may seem like an obvious answer, as ethics would be an obvious topic, but we need to bring it out and put it on the floor and have them all take it down as notes. Okay, so now I'm gonna bother you. No, you guys have the end part. I'm gonna go over here to the beginning part. Okay, so folks who read the first part of this long report.
Is this the first part? Because I thought we had bookends.
Okay, well, it's not exactly the first part. Okay, I should, this is a very good point from the resource library. I took all the meeting minutes that you have distributed in chunks, and then I tacked onto the top of it some various other things related to Tuskegee. And for those of you who read the tail end, and I put some things at the end. So this is a Heather Mcrae editing of primary source documents for the Tuskegee experiment. So, go ahead.
It was very literal as far as like breaking down the percentages of who died of what and how to do the autopsy and things of that nature. But at the end of the document, it talked a little bit about, okay, well, do we continue this or not? That was the big decision they were trying to make. So we're talking after the studies happened in the 60s as well. And trying to make this decision of like, all right, is this, it doesn't even get into ethics really, or even treatment of individuals, but it talks about the idea of is this a racial problem? Are we getting into this idea of racism that we need to deal with.
So I would glob on to the race word there and stick it up next to ethics. And that's an interesting point. Is the word ethics or ethical used at any point in what you read? Interesting.
Although I would also note that in reading the first document, which dates from 1940, knowing that this was the Tuskegee case, I noticed they crossed off a bunch of names of people who were going to receive the port, and only one person ended up receiving the port, which to me, I thought, that's very suspicious. Why do we go from 4 people scheduled to get this report to 1 person?
Excellent. Actually, I had not picked up on that. That's very good. No, I mean, because that is suspicious, and we can make an interesting argument in our primary source resource paper about that. And then, you know, you would have to give your classmate credit if you chose to do that as well. It's a little bit of a rule, right? But absolutely, why are we going? And they are declassified, the section that stamped declassified or whatever is not visible, but why? Why going from 4 to 1 person? Anybody want to venture a guess? Anybody?
Shrink the circle of culpability.
Shrinking the circle of culpability. Boy, that's hard to say. Anybody else have any ideas as to why this memorandum from the 1940s would go from 4 people to 1 person receiving it? Based on what you read or think you might know?
Study's already not going well.
Study's already not going well, and it's a 30-year-long study. So what we have here is some earlier documents, and so what Dr. Kern's talking about is also providence to some degree, like who wrote this? So this is the stakeholder thing. Why did they send it to this first 4 people? And then why did they end up only sending it to the 1 person? That's all very pertinent information that we don't exactly know the answer to, but we can take some educated guesses and then back it up with some secondary sources and triangulate it. Okay. Let's go to the folks that had the last part of this set of documents right here. I'm gonna pick on you guys.
Yeah, okay, so we got the end of the meeting minutes, and then we got a memorandum from the Assistant Secretary for Health saying that they're terminating the study. All patients should be getting the necessary steps to getting the right medical care that they need. And then we have a little bit of interview notes where they're talking with at least one subject. And the subject doesn't really seem to know sort of what was going on, what was happening, wasn't really in contact with anyone else at that point. Didn't know if anyone had actually gotten help at all. They were just very unsure about everything that was happening, so.
And we also got a copy of the certificate that people who participated in the study actually received.
Here's what you get. You get this nice little U.S. Public Health Service. Yay for you. You did it. You were a guinea. That's an excellent question. Can any of you figure out if they've been compensated in any way?
$25?
Yes, 25. And then there was discussion, I think, in this group of maybe $50 would be better, maybe 100 for burial, maybe 200. You know, I mean, like you said earlier, it's a very matter of fact, without emotion, set of documents intended to, at least this minutes from a meeting anyway, cover up, or maybe not cover up, but, well, yeah, cover up. At least present, as Melanie said, in a more digestible way, the outcomes of a 30-year government-funded study, which don't look that great on paper. And so they're trying to find ways to handle that situation, and they're calling it political. They're calling it racial, and there are medical ethics involved here. By the time we get post-World War II, post-Nuremberg trials, you betcha things have changed. The whole social political topography changed from the moment they began this study in the late 30s, early 40s in different in Macon County, up until when they finally terminated, right? So 30 years of time. So what I tell my students is, what major events happened concurrent to this study that would impact this study. Oh, well, there's a few things. There's a world war, there's civil rights movement, you know, so we kind of get to these big picture ideas. And the reason why they're probably referring to it as political is because in 1968-69, when they have this meeting, you betcha it's political. Anybody want to take a guess, stab, other than my historians, as to what's going on in 1968, 1969 across the world, quite frankly, or at least in the US? Vietnam, so there's protests about that. The beginning of the seeds are being sown of counter-hegemonic or protest type movements against the government. A little bit of doubt's been cast on the government. It's our first televised war, right? You know, so people got skin in the game here. What else? You're looking like you could answer. But so civil rights movements, you know, so we've got a whole ton of court cases that are coming out of the Supreme Court that are favoring equality under the Constitution. What amendment would I maybe possibly be talking about? See, and if you were in my class, they would just know it like that. So the 14th Amendment, we talk about the 14th Amendment in here, and we talk about violation of human rights under the 14th Amendment, which there's, if you've ever read it, it's rather verbose, the 14th Amendment. But in 1927, a Supreme Court case sort of cracked everything up called Buck versus Bell. And Buck versus Bell was about a young woman, Carrie Buck, who gave birth out of wedlock and was determined to be a quote unquote moron based on her IQ score. So she was separated from her baby and put into the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. Eventually, she filed a grievance, and eventually somebody took her seriously, and it went to the Supreme Court, and they upheld Virginia state law that Virginia was within their right to sterilize her without consent, because she'd already had a baby out of wedlock. So there are these things going on about consent and ethics that are building and building and building, and then we get to World War II, and we have, of course, our Third Reich and all the lovely talk about a supreme and superior race. That's why race and ethics is great to talk about here. I sort of left you guys out in the back because I wanted to give you time to read. What did you read? Probably the same thing as some other folks, but, or would you like to say anything about what you read?
It's a study about patients and the impact of this study across the years and the survival rate. It's interesting, as I said, because the study covers a lot of years. It would be interesting to see the impact of historical event on the study.
Yeah.
The people are reporting on their activities and the concern about the study and how to further involve the patient in this study.
Yeah, if you guys didn't hear, he's raising a very good point, which I try to raise with my students. This is a really lengthy study. And from a straight up scientific perspective, the data that can be gleaned from a study that runs that long is unbelievable if it was done, you know, correctly with the right variables and the right controls, right? But on the other hand, as you pointed out, this sort of, forget the word you used, the people, the participants in here are sort of lost in this, or what did you say exactly? I don't want to misrepresent you.
The point is that the study is very long,
yeah,
and it's important to involve the people, so the patients. Many of them died.
Right.
It's very difficult for a long study to understand why they died and how the historical events put effort. Of course, there is underlying disease that probably is the major cause.
Mhm.
okay, of the death. And
Yeah, so one of the problems of a long study is the subjects die. And then to isolate the reason for their death might become more, at least from a pathological perspective, difficult, right? Like if they already have cirrhosis of the liver, is that because of the syphilis, or is that because of drinking, or what's going on to these and the autopsy reports, by the way, are just horrific. All the livers are decayed. Many of them have lung disease and heart disease by the time they crack them open. And so sometimes they put down that they didn't die of syphilis, which then skews the results and the data that comes out of the study. So from one perspective, you could say, well, you didn't even get what you wanted from these people. You can't even prove any of this over this long period of time. And others will say, like, well, but we do know this. So, thank you. What did anybody here want to comment on what you read? Anything?
We kind of read the first section also, and then we didn't really have much chance to discuss it. So
It's okay.
it is kind of strange that it is really about not only just the results, the fact that they are where they're going to send these results to, and ultimately it's just a reporting of what they're going to do with this now that it's 1968.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so it's really difficult to even tell who's written what.
There you go.
Because we did talk about that and we couldn't figure out who really wrote the document.
And that goes back to what Dr. Kearns was saying, like why is only, well, she has a different memorandum, but why does this one person, and who wrote all of this? You know, are we assuming that there was a secretary in the room, because that's the word they would have used then, and that she's just transcribing everything, and yes, probably was a female, or is this different voices in those minutes speaking? Like, we don't know unless they call them out in these meeting minutes who exactly is deciding or saying what. Like, we don't know exactly who suggested 25 or 50. It's just in the minutes, right? So that makes historians like me irritated, and we want to go back to the beginning. So if I was using this in a research seminar, I would tell students to make a list of names and places and go figure out. Go find out who they were, where they worked, what their lives looked like, right? Okay, so in case you haven't figured it out, what we would pull this all together at the end of class or towards the end of class would be, yes, this was the US Tuskegee study, which experimented with a probable cure for syphilis. They began injecting volunteers in Macon County, whereas mostly African-American poor sharecroppers offered them money to volunteer. And once they were in the study, there were several different control groups, and one control group out of each section did not receive any injections or any therapeutic medicine. The other groups received varying degrees of injections of syphilis and an anti-syphilis serum that had been proven to be awful at best. 4 out of every 5 people injected with this experimental serum that was made with either a combination of snake venom or a plasmodium from malaria, usually made the person who received the injection extraordinarily ill, right? So they can't, so they were trying to find initially, and I always point this out to students, they had good intentions, I think, from a scientific perspective, in that they wanted to try to track and understand and cure syphilis, but they did not do that. Yeah.
Was the penicillin discovered like
Yes.
within 3 years of the study as well?
Yes,
And
thank you.
They figured out pretty fast that to treat syphilis.
Yeah, and so if you can catch it early enough, penicillin is a remarkable drug. In fact, it was used before it was circulated in the United States during World War II, specifically for the various sorts of sexually transmitted diseases and problems that could come up while abroad, while away from home, or even at home. So once penicillin enters the picture, then that's a whole nother ballgame, and that's 51, 52, 53, yet the study goes to 68, 69. That's part of the debate. Should we give them penicillin? Part of that debate also is it too late? And unfortunately, it was too late for many of them, right? So President Clinton had the last survivor up to the Rose Garden to issue a formal apology, and then tried to, what's the word I'm looking for, remuneration, tried to back that, hired a team to figure out how much every family was due. And in the end, I think it was something like they got 150,000, maybe. Some of the families, the grandchildren of these folks. Okay, so I know I have to wrap up. What I showed you today was one method of experiential teaching, or teaching by learning by doing, right? I find that it's easier to engage students if I give them something like this, and we have something to talk about. In particular, I've had students gasp at the certificate of completion. I've had students, and most of my students in social history of medicine are pre-med, and I also had one student notice that at the end, they note that the pathology is not even dependable. So the pathology from the autopsies, the very reason that they sort of started this study is to get pathological results, is not even conclusive or really usable. And that in and of itself, the student said, from a medical perspective, is a true loss, you know, and I'd have to agree. The other thing I do is a sort of, and I put the, I think on the next slide I have the link, but there is this thing called reacting to the past. It started at Barnard College, it's live action role play. And in the class I team teach with Dr. Tanona and Dr. Dodd, Perspectives on Science, Philosophy 501, we run games for end of unit exams or simulations. And one of the simulations that we run is a eugenics meeting, a Department of Eugenics at University of Kansas meeting to discuss the ethics of moving forward with their tests and their eugenics studies of, let's see if I have my, so we do the same thing, I hand out documents, we do a cold read, and then the one thing, we also use images that they can analyze. For instance, I put this image on a midterm exam for them, and I said, tell me about this image, and hit historical turning points. So this is the Kansas State Fair 1903, and that is the Eugenics and Health exhibit that was set up by Dr. Florence Sherborne, who started the Eugenics Department at University of Kansas. And she would go from state fair to state fair and run these competitions for the fittest families. And the nationwide program was Fitter Families for Future Firesides. Say that a lot of times in a row fast. This Fitter Families for Future Firesides program created a rubric of what the fittest person would look like. And then everybody else was just not supposed to be in the gene pool, right? Or they were supposed to be isolated or sterilized. And so what they also read are documents used like intake records from the Kansas Women's Industrial Farm in Lansing. So by the time we get interwar years here, we're seeing a lot of women, you can't tell from this document, we're seeing a lot of women getting arrested under Chapter 205, which was a sexual misconduct law. Basically, if you looked like you might have syphilis or gonorrhea and were out after curfew and hanging with the wrong people and drinking at the wrong time in the wrong place, you got your butt hauled in. And then you got an exam. And if you were found to be carrying an STD, you were imprisoned indefinitely. And you were sent to Bell Memorial Hospital, which is now KU Medical Center, for your treatments. So that's another one I do. At the end of that eugenics unit, they play out parts of each person that would be in that eugenics department. And they play out the parts of wardens from the prison who have some skin in the game. And I assign them various roles: lawyers, doctors, politicians, and they have to come to a consensus. Teaching them Robert's rules was no fun. My 4-H students do very well with Robert's rules, but I have to use Robert's rules light in my class when I run a mock meeting, right? And they have to only use information that would have been available to the historical figures they're impersonating at that time. So they can't whip out their cell phone and go. Okay. They have to be like, not dressed up, but in character. And so those are a couple things that I do to mix it up in the classroom. These visuals, pretty much I don't have to do anything with them because they're so amazing. This is the outcome of one of those eugenics fairs, and people would travel hundreds of miles to sit there and have their urine and blood analyzed and have everything measured and their intelligence tested. So this little girl here, next to the big cow, she got the fittest girl, I think like 7 or under, a different category. Up there is the fittest juvenile young woman. And then here's a mugshot of a young woman who was arrested under Chapter 205. She didn't know she had syphilis until she was arrested by a local, by county sheriff, and brought into a doctor. The doctor diagnosed her, and then she was sent up, they call it up, to the women's prison. She was 16. Age of consent was 16. So if you're 16 or older, you go big girl prison. So some of them research these various prisoners at Kansas State Historical Society. My students often ask, what's the deal with the hair? And I then talk about Louise Brooks and the bob and some few other things. But also in some of these, you'll note that their shirts are buttoned all the way up. And a friend of mine who is a doctor said that that might be that they were hiding goiters. Anybody know what a goiter is? So like low iron deficiency, depression years. That's it. So those are the two things that I do in classrooms, also with my colleagues, to engage my students. Any questions? Yes.
I have a very leading question.
Okay.
How do you feel activities like this change the dynamic in a class of mix of majors and non-majors?
Very good question. I have not had, so my control group has been social history of medicine, right? And almost exclusively not history majors, which was one of the reasons I chose primary sources, because sometimes my pre-med students are rather skeptical of what happened. And this just pretty much takes that off the table. And then we can get straight to a discussion. Like, yes, it happened. Here are the documents. That works for them. But when I do it in Philosophy 501, I have help. And I need a lot of help because the classroom's like 45. So if you have TAs or undergraduate teaching assistants, they can be enormously useful for the game playing or the role playing. It's hard in perspectives in science. Most of them are in fact science majors. We developed a class so we could have a humanities link for the science kids and have it relate to them. So we talk about the ethics of science, at least Dr. Tanona does Bayes theory, I still don't understand it. Anyway, it's very hard with the mixed group. We have to do almost 4 weeks of prep. And so we integrate it into the course material we're teaching. They read the prison records. Dr. Tanona gets up and does some probability of, if you lived in Coffeyville in 1923, what were the chances that you would get picked up, you know, for Chapter 205? So they do census records, population breakdowns, they do all of this before the game. And that's supposed to And then Dr. Chinona thinks of things that like the more math-oriented kids would like, and he gives them a sort of separate set of documents and asks them to, like some of the tables and charts you saw in these, he asked them to tabulate those and run some probabilities on them. And then my colleague, Dr. Dodd, gets up and throws them poems like the yellow wallpaper about a woman being strapped down and force-fed milk for hysteria. And that's how we pull it all together. But it is very difficult with varying degrees of capability. That's why the group work kind of helps. Because then they can be in their own little group and say, I have no idea what's happening. And can you please help me? You know, and they do that. I hear them go, I didn't read this at all. Another thing, little technical point that I've learned, if you assign any documents or large files like this, I don't print them out for them. They have to already have it downloaded on their laptop, computer, whatever, when they come into class. Because otherwise, nobody can download anything during class, right? And then it's a big mess. So I send out a reminder, and then I do bring a couple hard copies for kids that don't have devices, but I banned them from looking at it on their phone because I hate this. Because they're talking like this, yeah.
How does that work when you give some groups a middle section? I mean, they download the whole document.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So everybody gets after class. I put the whole document online.
But you have them download from a certain section?
Yes, yes. So, oh, thank you, very good point. So on Canvas, I make groups, and each group gets their section, and they're in their own little silo. They come to class not knowing, well, unless they talk to each other, some of them do, you know, oh, I got this part, what weird part did you get? Oh, okay. And then they come to class. Yeah, that's a good. And then after class, everybody gets the whole thing, so they can put it together and write their paper. Yeah.
So this is hard, right?
Yeah.
It's hard on the students. It's October, they're tired.
Mhm.
Do you find it's hard to inspire them to put this kind of work and effort into this? If you need to just kind of look at this, I had to read the first page 3 or 4 times just to get the tenor of the document and kind of pursue that. And do you find it affects attendance at all? That if a student's just like, I don't want to play today.
I don't play it. I think it can, and I have noticed the October slump, right? I usually throw in, you know, so we would do, like, we'd come to class, I'd do some content, you have what I call humanitarian break, you come back, we do this, and then have another break, because it's 3 hours, and then we do what I call a post-mortem, like, okay, what was wrong? What did you get? What went wrong for you? And they write it down and they send it to me, or they hand it to me. So one of the things the student said was, it's just too much to read too quickly. And I was like, you know, I'm a historian, so sometimes I don't, I can read pretty quick. And I said, well, what would be helpful? And they said, if we all just read one paragraph. I'm like, now you're pushing it. And so what I decided was I would put in a few little video things. Okay, there's a couple of documentaries on the Tuskegee experiment where they interview Nurse Rivers. And so they'll come back from the break and I'll throw up like Nurse Rivers YouTube thing. I'm like, what do we all think about Nurse Rivers? They're all like, she sold her people out. And then somebody else goes, no, she did what she had to survive and try, you know what I mean? And so then so I kind of let that organically move, and then I rope them back in. There's also, for the eugenics stuff, there's a lot. There is a documentary that they did on people in Alabama who were sterilized in the 20s and 30s. There's this one very great clip where it's this older guy in his overalls, and he says, I didn't know I couldn't have kids. They never told me what they did to me, and I might wanted to have had them. And that gets them every time, because they're just like, oh, he didn't even know. Like, he got married, they kept trying, nobody told him. He was sterilized when he was 12 at a boys' home. You know, and then they go to the doctor, and the doctor's like, you can't. Yeah. To the what?
To online courses. And if yes, how?
You know, my dean and I have discussed this a couple of times, because they do have an online course, Modern Mexico, and they do read things like the Mexican, call for independence. They read, a statement by Pancho Villa and stuff like that. But I tell you, the discussions we have online about these documents are far different than in the classroom. I just don't know how to make this work in an online platform. Maybe I'm missing some software tools or some steps along the way, but I'm gonna be all old fashioned here and say, I just don't know how I could replicate this online. I think I could probably do it if they all zoomed in, right? If it was, everybody had a computer and everybody zoomed in at the same time. But many students take online courses because they have restrictions to their time, right? Like they have to work all day or all night, and so they can't all be on their computers at the same time. So I'm open to ideas about how to make something like this work online. I just don't know.
Could you LARP it? And because I'm immediately thinking how I constantly communicate with my colleagues via email. I'm trying to make decisions via email. So could you then, instead of like doing an in-person thing, like they have to decide, they have to report this to some agency or some investigative panel, and they have to work together via email to figure out how are we going to present this information.
Or like that. Simulate it as a deposition being taken and then offer it in a trial. So this is the videotaped deposition of witnesses, and now have lawyers say, this is what I extract from that deposition.
Oh.
And then another set, you see you sign them different versions of the legal. You're representing, in this case, maybe a pharmaceutical company, you're representing the government, you're representing plaintiffs who represent the Tuskegee.
You see data in front of you. Yeah.
So now you talk about, is it ethical data, what's the compensation process, and then distant students can be deposed. And you have each team come up with questions, and then that distant student takes those deposition questions, videotapes their response, and offers that. So now you can have a blended classroom.
Oh, I like that. I like that so much. I will tell you, no, I like this. I'm going to totally try that in the spring. When I offer social history of medicine and perspectives in science again. I will tell you, this takes a lot of out of the class online organization. You got to have the Canvas groups up. You have to have every instruction meticulously and tightly written out. Otherwise, they'll be like, but you didn't say that we had to do. And then we came here and you expected. And then we all look at it and we're like, no, we didn't do that. Okay, never mind. So you have to be on it like way before the students are. So in the LARPing games, live action role playing games, and some of my students, when they find out we're live action role playing, go, oh, yes. And others go, so you have to have them turn in their role, who they're going to be, like 3 weeks in advance, and give a bio on that is realistic. Before they can come in for the mock meeting or deposition, they have to write 2 pages about their character and their character's place in the world, and it has to be reasonable. Last time we did this, we had an unusually high amount of female neurosurgeons for 1935. I was like, you might want to think about it. Yes, there were some, maybe, but and so all of this happens before the game, and then after the game, they write a post-mortem. What I would have said had I had time or felt more boisterous during the game. Because we have some students that are extroverts and they're right on it. And then we have introverts who I've read their work, but they're just like, they don't want to talk. And so then they have the opportunity to still get a good grade with their written work. And we also learned, because we're all getting older, that their character names have to be written very big on on cards that sit in front of them, because otherwise, like Elizabeth Dodd and I were like, okay, Constable so-and-so. So these are all these little picky details that, after doing it several times, we're like, oh, remember that. Oh, remember this. So it's kind of evolves all the time. But I love this online deposition and response and back and forth. Wow, that sounds like if I can get it set up, it would be, yeah, it's the setting up. It's the setting up. And sometimes, to be honest, I get frustrated with Canvas because if I form groups, then the groups can't interact unless I then rearrange the groups, because each group is a silo in and of itself. And they said they're working on it, but man, that's tough to get around sometimes. Any other questions? Well, my email is on the PowerPoint, which I don't know if anybody can make available, but if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, I mean, I'm Heather McCrea in the history department. I'm sure you can find me.
So if you want credit for this event, for our professional development series, please complete the post-event survey on this, and please join me.
And if you would like the other sections, just for fun, they're up here. Because trees were sacrificed, so.